We want combat! We want combat! Today's video is going to be pretty similar as the previous one because we're also going to create some scenarios, but this time we're automatically going to start the combats as soon as the level is loaded instead of having the units walk in the overworld and then trigger a combats by themselves. We're automatically going to start the combat, and as soon as the level is loaded, the player is going to be in combat against the opposing team. So let's get to it. So in Unreal, the first thing we're going to do is create our first level, our first combat level. So that's going to be inside the maps folder. I created myself a new combats folder right here, and inside it I'm going to create myself a new level, which I'm going to name L_combat_fair duel. And now we can open it to add all the elements we need. And the first thing we need to add are the sub-levels we're going to use. So I'm going to go in my sub-level folder, add the lighting as usual, and also the level square, because that one's going to be on a level square. I'm going to make them both always loaded. So when I press play, they are going to be loaded by default. So press play, here we go. All my levels are loaded. Perfect. Now let's double click on the persistent level, make sure that it is selected because we're going to add all the missing elements for the game to work. So the first thing is the player start. So I'm just going to drop it right here. Doesn't really matter. Then I'm going to need the player action so the player can interact with the game. So add the BP player action in there. I'm also going to need the combat system. So search for combat system. Here we go. I'm also going to need the grid because the combat system needs the grid to work. So let's add the grid in the combat. Here we go. So now all the actors are in the proper level. I'm just going to select all of them and drop them inside a new folder I just created, the L combat fair duel, so it's organized properly. I'm going to put the grid under the combat system. Doesn't really matter, but I like to do that. So here we go. And now we just need to assign the references. So I'm going to go in my combat system right here and assign the grid just like that. And finally, in the BP player actions, we have to assign the combat system just like that. We're not going to assign any overworld unit group manager because we're not going to move in the overworld. We're directly going to start in combat, so we don't need the overworld unit group manager. Now the last thing that is missing is a few units that we're going to use to start the combat. So I'm going to go in my BP unit right here and add 6 units on the grid. So let's do that real quick. And here they are. So on the left I have one team and on the right I have another team. We can see here in the top right corner that I've placed them into 2 different folders, the team 1 and team 2 folders. And I've also included team 1 and team 2 in their names because we're going to do the same thing we did in the previous video and use the unit's name to place them into the combat. So let's make sure that the names are easily identifiable, and then we're going to use them in the code. So on the left I have my first team, which contains a warrior, a priest, and a ranger. And on the right I have the same thing. I have a warrior, a ranger, and a priest. And also make sure that their position makes sense on the grid because we're going to use the unit's position to determine where we want to spawn them in combat. So perfect. Now we're ready to feed all that information to the combat system and start a combat with it. And to do that, we're going to do the same exact thing we did in the previous video and use a new blueprint to feed all that information. So I'm going to go in my blueprints folder, in my scenarios, and create myself a new blueprint actor just right here. I'm going to name it BP_combat scenario, and I'm going to take that blueprint, put it in the level somewhere. Doesn't really matter the location, so I'm just going to place it right here, actually in that folder maybe, why not. Then I can save all, here we go, and open the blueprint. And for this blueprint to work, we need 3 variables, so 1, 2, and 3. The first variable is the combat system, so here it is, and it is of type BP combat system. Obviously, I've also opened the little eye icon right here because we want to set it in the editor before starting the game. Then we have the data of the grid, so grid data right here, which is of type sQuickCombat grid, and it's also instance editable, so we can set it in the editor. Finally, we have the units data, so the data of the units, which is of type sQuickCombat unit teams, and it's also instance editable. So we can set all those variables in the editor, and when we press play, all those variables are going to be fed to the combat system and start the combat. But I'm not going to input all that data manually. I'm going to create myself some functions the same way we did in the previous video. So create the first new function right here, which I named build teams based on unit names, and I'm also going to make it call in editor. That way we can call it in editor with a button press, and we're going to use that function to populate the units data. And for the logic, it's going to be pretty similar as the one in the previous video. So first we get all the units in the world, we look through them, and I'm going to set it into a new local variable just so it's a little bit cleaner. So now we have all the units that are currently in the world, and now we have to find in which team we want to add those units. So I'm going to move on the right a little bit, and I'm just going to determine the team index based on the display name of the unit the same way we did in the previous video. So I'm going to isolate the little 2 that we have right here. So if we do a split, we only have 2_priest, and then if we do another split, we have the 2, which is going to be the team index that I've set into a new local variable. Then that part is going to be a little bit different than a previous video because we're going to use an array instead of a mapping, because the units data right here uses a units team, and the units team right here is an array of array, which is the same exact variable type as we have right here. So the units team variable, a local variable, it is an array of S unit array. In there we can add all the units in their proper teams, and then we're going to be easily able to feed that variable directly into the units data. So that's why I created myself a new local variable, and we're going to add all the units inside that variable to the proper location. Perfect. Now we're going to move on the right here, and the first step is actually to make sure that we already have enough slots in the array so we can add the units in there. It's a little bit more complicated than a mapping, but it's not too bad. The first step is to check if the array is too small. So right here I'm going to check if the length of my array is smaller than the team index plus 1 because of the way the indexes work. Let's say I have an array of 5 elements and I want to add my units in the team 10, and that's not gonna work because the array is too small. So what we're gonna do is just add a bunch of the empty groups, so empty team 6, 7, 8, 9, and then in the team 10 we're going to add the units in there because, well, that's what we want to do. We want to add the unit in the team 10, even if we only have an array of 5 elements right now. So we're going to add a bunch of empty groups to be able to add the units in the 10th team. And the way we do that is by simply resizing our array. So the array has 5 elements in there, and now we want to add the units in the index 10. So we're going to make sure that the array has 11 elements. So that's why I'm doing a plus 1 right here. So the array has 11 elements, meaning that the last element is the index 10. And that's what we want. We want to be able to add the units in the index 10 of the array. And that's why we are doing a plus 1. So we're simply resizing the array. The array is too small. We're making it super big, and then we're going to add the units at the end. And that's exactly the next steps. Now that we're sure that the array is big enough, we can simply add the unit in the array. Make sure that you're doing a get reference right here, otherwise it will not work. It will only add the unit in a copy of that element in the array, so that will not work. It will not be part of the array anymore. It will be like on the side. It will be a copy on the side. It will not work. That's why you are using a reference right here. So it's not copying the whole array. It just puts the unit directly inside it. So let's get a reference right here, break the array, and add the unit in the unit team. Okay, good. So we're looping through all the units that are in the game, determining their team indexes, checking if the array is big enough to receive the unit. If it's not, we're making it bigger, and then we're simply adding the unit in the proper team in the unit teams array right here. Perfect. So now we have the units team array. We just have to feed it into the units data. So I'm gonna go back all the way at the beginning of the function right here. After doing the for each loop, I'm going to first remove all the empty groups we added in the units team. So let's say we added like 10 empty groups to make the array the proper size. Now we're just going to remove all those empty groups because they don't matter anymore. So let's just remove all of them. And once we're done doing that, we can simply set the units team inside the units data. Perfect. And now we should be able to test that. So let's compile, go back in the level. I'm going to select my combat scenario that I have right here. I'm going to scroll down a little bit. And now in my units data, we can see that I don't have any teams. But if I click on my button, here we go. Now I have 2 teams. If I expand those 2 teams right here and right there, we can see that in the first team, I have my team 1 warrior, priest, and ranger. And in my second team, I have team 2 warrior, priest, and ranger. Perfect. So it seems to work, and I can clear the structure, repopulate it, and it works pretty fine. Perfect. Now we're done adding the units in the units data. Good. Now we just need to populate all the other elements. But first, while I'm here, I'm just going to set my combat system. Why not? We're here and it takes 2 seconds. Good. So that's done. Now we can go back in the combat scenario and create a new function to continue populating the structures. I named it build AI list based on team indexes, and I also made it call in editor because we also want a button to be able to execute that function. And the thing we're going to do inside that function is build the units controlled by an AI. That list right here that is inside the units data, we're going to populate it. So I'm just going to promote that into a new local variable right here, my AIs. And the way we're going to do it is that we're simply going to add all the units that are not part of the team index 0, because in my case, the player is going to control the index, the team index 0, and all the other teams are going to be controlled by an AI. I'm keeping it super simple. In your case, if you want the player to be able to control multiple teams, you can also change that if you want. But in my case, let's keep it simple for now. So let's loop through all the units team in the units data. So we populated the units data just right here. and then we are using that list to determine, okay, are they AIs or not? So loop through all of them, and then we check the array index to make sure that it is not equal to 0. If it's equal to 0, it's controlled by the player, so it's not going to be an AI. But if it's not equal to 0, well, we want them to be an AI, so let's just add them into the AIs list. So break the unit array right here and then append that into the AIs list that we can then feed into the structure, and that's it. Now let's compile and go see how it looks in the game. So in my combat scenario right here, I have all my units team that are populated with the other button, and now if we click on build AI list, it should populate the unit controlled by an AI just like that. Now all the units that are in teams 2, team 2, team 2, team 2 are controlled by an AI. And actually, I'm realizing that it's a bit confusing because we're using the index 0 right here, and then in my game, I have my team 1 and team 2. The team 0 doesn't actually exist, but it's actually the team 1 because of the way the array work. Yeah, okay, it's a little bit confusing. It works because my team 1 right here is downgraded to team 0 because the team 0 is completely empty when we generate the list. So the team 1 becomes the team 0, and then the teams 2 become the team 1, and then that's why these units are controlled by an AI, but these are not. And yeah, I think it's a little bit too confusing, so I'm actually just going to rename my team. So my team 1 is going to become team 0, and my team 2 is going to become team 1. Just like that. And now if we go back in the combat scenario, we can see that if I click on my buttons to build the teams and the AI list, in my team, the array index 0 should match with the team 0. So team 0, team 0, team 0 in the array index 0. Same thing for the array index 1 should receive all the units in the team index 1. And then the units controlled by an AI only contains the team index 1. Perfect. So now it makes more sense. It's a little bit more clean, and now we can go do the next step, which is another function. Function that we're going to use to set the units desired indexes inside the units data. So I named it build the desired grid indexes based on units location. I also made sure to make it callable in editor, so we have a button to call it. We're going to use this function to convert the position of the unit into a grid index. So let's do that. I'm going to set the units desired index inside the units data at the end of the function so that I can promote that into a new local variable right here, the desired indexes. And now what we're going to do is just loop through all the units to find which index we should place the unit on. So let's do that. I'm going to loop through all my teams, all my units teams. For all my teams, I'm going to loop through all the units that are in the team, and then I'm going to ask the grid, okay, can you give me the grid index based on the actor location of the unit in the world? And that's exactly what's going to happen. The grid's going to give us an index, which we then add inside the desired indexes right here. So for other units, we're converting the position into indexes, and then at the end, we can set that back inside the units data. Perfect. So now let's compile and go see how it looks. So in the level, I'm going to select my BP combat scenario, and then we have a new button right here, a third button. So if I re-expand my units data right here, we can see that we don't have any units desired index, but if I click on the new button, build the desired grid indexes, it populates the mapping right here, and now all the units have different indexes based on their position in the world relative to the position of the grid. But now those indexes don't always make sense because we have some units that are on the grid and some units are not on the grid, these ones right here. So their position, their indexes are outside of the world, and that's not really good. So what we're going to do is update the grid based on where we want to place the grid in the world, so we don't have to use the whole map. We can just use some parts of the level if we want to. So we're just going to move the grid around and place it to the right locations. But since I really like having the idea of controlling everything directly inside the combat scenario instead of having to change some things in the grid, some things in the combat system, some things in the grid scenario, blah blah blah, I'm just going to use the grid data directly in the grid scenario and feed them to the BP grid. So that's what we're gonna do. Let's go back in the combat scenario, and this time I'm gonna go in the construction first. Because we don't really have too much information we want to set automatically inside the grid data structure. We only have the center location. I think that can be set automatically. Everything else are information that we have to enter manually every time because it's really based on the level you want to create. But for the center location, is actually super simple. We just have to use the position of the combat scenario in the level. So get the actor location, which is the combat scenario, and feed it inside the grid data automatically. Now if I compile and go back in the level, if I move my combat scenario in the world, so it is right here, and I move it around, we can see that the values of the center location of the grid gets updated based on the position of the actor in the world. Yay! Now we just have to feed that into the real grid because the grid doesn't get updated right now, only the combat scenario. So we're gonna move the combat scenario, which is going to update the grid. So let's go back in there and create a new function for that. I named hit spawn grid, and the logic is pretty simple. We just have to check if the combat system and the grid are valid, and if so, we can simply call the spawn grid function on the grid and feeding it all the information coming from the grid data, which is going to update the grid for us. Now we can just go back in the construction script, and every time we move the grid in the world, we're going to call the spawn grid function, so it re-updates the grid in the level. Now we can go back and test it. So now my combat scenario is right here, and we can see that the grid gets updated when I move it around, so that's pretty good. So I can place it wherever I want. So let's say right here, doesn't really matter, it's the region I want to use for my combat, but actually it's a little bit too big, so I'm going to go play in my grid data right here to reduce the size of my grid to, let's say, something that looks a little bit like that. As you can see, I'm not using the whole world, I'm just using that little part right here. I just want this zone to be used in my combat, and now that my grid is placed properly in the world and all my units are on top of the grid, now I can go back in my unit indexes, so right here, and click on build the desired grid indexes, and that's going to regenerate all the indexes of all my units based on the new grid that is now big enough to cover all the units. And actually, if you don't want to always click on that button manually, you can just place it in the construction script also, so I can just build my generated grid indexes right here, my desired grid indexes, right after spawning the grid, just like that. Now if I move my grid around, it should update all the indexes of all my units, as you can see on the right. Perfect, so that's so much better. And now we finally have all the data we need to be able to start a combat. So let's go do that. I'm gonna go in the combat scenario, I'm gonna go in my event graph, and we're gonna do that in the begin play, and I'm simply going to do a quick start combat right here. On the combat system, quick start combat, feeding it the grid data and the unit data, and also self as the object that started the combat. Perfect, now we should be able to compile, save, and go test in the game. Okay. We're in combat, that's good, but we have a few errors, so let's go fix them first. I'm gonna stop and go see how it looks. So if I click on the error, it brings us right here in the BP unit in the set team index, and it says that the HP bar right here is not valid, and that's probably because the widget HP bar is not completely initialized yet. So what we're going to do is just check if the HP bar is valid before trying to set the color and opacity. And actually, since we're here, instead of doing the set fill color and opacity right here, I'm just going to update the HP bar instead, because we want to update the whole HP bar, not only the color and opacity. So I'm just going to delete this, and I'm going to replace it that way. So we're checking if the HP bar is valid first. Okay, is the HP bar valid? And if so, we're going to update the whole HP bar, not only the color and opacity. Perfect. Now I'm just going to add the reroute nodes, and there we go. So now if the HP bar is valid, it's going to update it. Otherwise, it's just going to skip the update of the HP bar and execute the rest of the logic. Perfect. So now if I compile and go back in the game, we should now have, yes, we have a working game and we don't have any errors. That's pretty good. I can move around. I should be able to cast my spell as usual. That's pretty good. I can end my turn, move around, cast spells. We can see the colors of the HP bar are normal. So here on the left I have my blue team, and on the right I have my red team, and that works pretty fine. That's good. Now all the units are playing their turn as usual. That's pretty good. And if I end my combat, we can see what happens. Nothing happens, because we never implemented the logic that reacts when the combat is ended. Right now, it just stays in that state forever. So let's just press stop and go implement the logic we want to do when the combat is finished inside the BP combat scenario. And the first step to do that is to hook ourselves to the callback that is called when the combat is ended before starting the combat. So we hook ourselves to that callback, and then we can start the combat. Once the combat is ended, it's going to call our new event right here. In there, I'm just going to check if the object that started the combat is myself, because I don't want to react if, let's say, the debug menu started a combat. Only if myself started the combat, then I'm going to start another combat, because that's what I want to do. I want to heal all the units that were in the combat and then start a new one. So let's do that. I'm going to loop through all the unit teams that are in the combat. For all my teams, I'm going to loop through all the units that are in that team, and then I'm going to reset their health point, put the units back to normal, fully healed, and then once we're done resetting all the units, I'm just going to start another combat the same way we did right here. Starting a new combat, feeding it the same exact data, and then it's going to start another combat. Actually, it should. So let's try it. I'm gonna go in the game, move my units around. There we go, it seemed to work. I can hit my other units to see if the healing works. So I'm just going to attack my other units for fun. Here we go, do some damage. The AI should start their turn attacking my units too, so that's pretty good. And then if I end my combat, everything stops. And then when I reset, here we go. Now all my units are back to where they were before, and they are healed properly. Perfect. I should be able to start another combat as many times as I want to, and then I can just end my combat again, end the combat again, and the combat again, and here we go. All my units get reset properly. That's pretty good. There's just one thing though. I have all my units in the combat turned 3 times, 4 times, 6 times. Okay, yeah, they are getting added over and over and over and over for some reason. Yeah, that's not normal. Okay, let's go see what's happening. Let's go take a look at the flow real quick. So in the combat scenario, we're starting a combat right here. And once the combat is ended, we're going to start the combat again. So I'm pretty sure that the problem is in this function right here. It's going to start a combat over and over and over. And I think that's the issue. So I'm going to go in my quick start combat right here. And here at the beginning, we are generating the grid. That's pretty good. That's not an issue. Then I'm going to go on the right. This is where we are adding the units in combat. So getting the indexes and everything, placing them on the grid, and then adding them in the combat. So okay, I think that's where the problem is. We are always adding the units in combat, but let's go see in the function to see how it looks. And right here at the beginning of the function, we are adding the unit in combat list. Here we go, and we're never checking if we were actually able to add the unit in combat or if the unit was already in the combat before adding it. So we are continuously adding unit in combat, adding the unit in combat over and over and over. So the list right here contains multiple copies of the same unit, and we don't want that. So what I'm going to do is just check if we already have the unit in combat before adding it. So I'm just going to move that out of the way right here. Check if my units in combat contains the new unit. If it contains it already, I'm just going to remove the unit from combat. So the unit is already in combat when we try to add it. So let's remove it, and then we can simply add it to the right location with the right settings and everything. Good. So that should fix the issue. Let's compile and go see in the game. Okay, everything works as before, so that's great. I'm just gonna move around, attack, do a few spells and things like that. There we go. I can end my turn, cast my spell as before. The AI is going to play its turn. That seems to work. And once I'm done, I'm just going to end the combat. And now all my units are respawned properly at the right place. They are healed to the max, and I only have one copy of each of my unit in the turn bar, and I can try that a few more times to make sure that it works properly. So end combat, end combat, end combat, end combat. Here we can see that all the units are only in the units bar one time, and that's pretty good. That fixed the issue. So now the player can play as many combats as he wants, and then once it's done, I guess he can close the game because there's nothing else to do right now. So that's pretty good. The mechanic seems to work. Now we can create as many scenarios as we want and let the player play all of them if we want to. So I guess we're pretty much done for today, but there's one last little thing that I would like to do before we go and create as many scenarios as we want. And it's that if I go back in the combat scenario right here and I go in the construction script, this construction script is also called at the beginning of the game because this object gets created when we load the level, and we don't really want to respawn the grid at that time. We don't want to spawn the grid in the game. We don't need to because it's already generated in the editor right here. So we just have to use that grid. We don't need to recreate the grid every time we play a new game. And if, let's say, your grid is really big, that spawn grid function right here might take a few seconds, and you don't want to do that every time. That just doesn't make sense. If your grid is generated already, just use it. Don't regenerate it. That just doesn't make sense. So in the combat scenario right here, before spawning the new grid, I'm just going to check, okay, am I in the game or in editor? If I'm in editor, that's fine. We can generate the new grid as many times as we want. But if I'm in the game, well, I don't want to do that. So let's go create the function that tells us if we are in the game or not. So I'm gonna do that in the function library we already created. So in utilities right here, we have the BFL utilities, and I'm going to create that new function. I named it is in game. I made it pure, and I'm returning a boolean telling us if we are in the game or not. And the way I'm checking if we are in the game or not is simply by checking if the player controller at index 0, so the first player in the game, is actually valid. Because if we have a player that is valid in the game, it means that, well, we are in the game. Otherwise, we are probably in editor. So that tells us if we are in the game. And now if we go back in the BP combat scenario at the beginning of the construction script, we can simply check, okay, are we in the game? Is in game? And if it's false, well, we are going to regenerate the grid. Otherwise, well, we're not going to, because the grid's already generated. It was generated in editor, and now we are in game, so we don't need to do it again. And that's it. That's all the features we needed to do today. Now I'm just going to go and create a few combat scenarios, and you can do the same. So I'm going to go in my maps in combat and create myself a new level. This one I'm going to name it L_combat_flying is cheating. And then I'm going to open it just like that. And the first thing we have to do is to add the levels we need. So in my sub levels, I'm going to add my lighting, and I'm also going to add the hexagon this time. Why not? So here they are. I'm going to make them always loaded. So right click, change streaming method always loaded for the level and also for the lighting, and then double click on the persistent level because we need to add all the blueprints that are missing. So the first blueprints we need are the combat system, why not? So combat system, here it is. We also need the combat scenario, and I have it right here, so why not dropping it in the scene? So combat system, combat scenario, we need the grid for the combat system to do its job, so add the grid in there, and also the player action so it can interact with everything else. So player action, here they are. So I have my 4 blueprints right here. I'm going to add them into a new folder with the same name as the level, so L combat flying is cheating, add everything in there. I'm going to place my grid under the combat system as usual, and then I'm gonna go in my combat system to set the references, so it needs a reference to the grid, so set the grid like that. In the combat scenario it needs a reference to the combat system, so why not setting the combat system right here, and in the player action it needs a reference to the combat system also, so set the combat system just like that. And I almost forgot, I also need a player start, so I'm gonna go in my place actor and add a player start in the level. Doesn't really matter, I'm adding it right here and move it in the same folder just like that. Now the grid is a square, but I would like it to be an hexagon, so I'm gonna go in my combat scenario and change the grid data. So in the grid data right here, I'm going to change the shape from a square to the hexagon, and I'm going to make it big enough so it covers the whole level just like that, I think. And the last thing that is missing are the units, so let's go in the blueprint, core in the units, and add a few units on top of the world. And here they are. On the left I have my warrior, ranger, and priest, and they are going to fight against a bunch of bats. So I have bats, a bunch of bats here and there. Now I can populate my variable inside my combat scenario, so I'm going to expand the combat scenario right here. Click on the first button that builds the team based on the unit name. Here we go. Now I have my 2 unit teams containing all the proper units, just like that. Then under that I have my list of units controlled by an AI, so we have to populate that one by clicking on the button, and now here we go. I have my list of AIs, and finally I need the desired indexes, which is the last button right here. And now if I expand, I can see that all my units are on top of the grid, and now if I press play, it should start the combat for me. And here we go. Now I can move my units around, I can cast some spell as usual, and my turn, the AIs should be able to play their turn also. Here we go, they are attacking my units, that's pretty good. And now if I end my combat, it should start over as usual. Perfect. And turn and turn and turn, start combat, and turn and turn and turn, start comeback, over and over and over until the end of time. That's good. Now you know how to create your own scenarios, and I'm actually going to create a few for myself, and then I'm going to show them to you. So, other than my 2 first levels, I created 5 new ones. So first I have my chicken hunt, which is the first level that I have right here. And in this one, the player can control 2 rangers right here, and they are fighting against a bunch of simple chickens. If you press play here, you can see that we have a bunch of chickens all over the place, and they are chased by 2 simple rangers, just like that. Okay, so that was my first one. Then I have my 4-player chess level right here, and in this one, we can see that we have multiple teams. We have 4 teams of unit. In the top right corner you can see that we have my team 1, team 2, team 3, and team 4, and they are all inside the combat scenario in different teams. So I have my unit teams right here. I have the team in 0, 1, 2, and 3, and all the units that are controlled by an AI and their position as usual. And now if I press play, we can see that since they are all in different teams, they all have different colors. So I have my blue teams, red team, purple, and also my green teams right here, and they are all playing after the other and all against each other also. So yeah, everything is playing just like that. Perfect. Now I'm gonna stop. Then I have my 3 last ones. That one is the combat so slimy. That one is on the triangle grid. I wanted to make it a little bit different. I'm controlling 2 default units, and I'm also fighting against a bunch of different slimes. Now if I play, I can move my units from the middle and fight against the slimes that are all over the place, all around us. Okay, so that's it for that one. Then I have my tables I've turned. In this one, it's a little bit more special. The player can control all the different mobs instead of controlling the default unit. So we can control a chicken, a slime, a few bats here and there. So my team 1 is controlling all the different mobs, and in my team 2, then I have my ranger, priest, and warriors. So if I press play, now I'm controlling a slime instead of a warrior, and I can attack all the different units that are in the middle, and that's going to make it a little bit more interesting than always controlling the same units over and over and over. And my last level is called Too Many Enemies, and in this one I'm controlling the same default unit as usual, but I have so many enemies all over the place, and if the player wants to survive, he's going to you have to be really careful. So anyway, I guess that's gonna be it for today's video. You can create as many levels as you want and include them inside your game. Or you can always copy my levels, but I think it will be way better if you create your own, and that's what's going to make your game way more interesting. But anyway, I guess that's gonna be it for today, and I'm gonna see you in the next one. Bye bye!